Remain here if you must, but the cabin is gone. Those words were recorded years later by a federal agent. They described a man standing beside the ashes of his own home. In 1858, on a plantation outside Natchez, an enslaved man named Jacob Carter survived the burning of the cabin where his family had lived. His wife and child had already been sold south months earlier. For the next 150 days, witnesses said he refused to leave the ground where that cabin had stood. 9 years later, in 1867, records from the Freedmen's Bureau would finally document what happened next. The man responsible for the separation of Jacob's family lost his estate to debt during Reconstruction. And Jacob Carter was recorded again, this time reuniting with the family he had searched for since the war ended. But in 1858, none of that had happened yet. In the winter of that year, plantation owner Edward Langford was expanding his holdings. His cotton fields stretched along the brown banks of the Mississippi River. Ledger entries recorded new purchases of land and laborers that season. Langford attended county gatherings. He was greeted by name at the courthouse steps. Merchants extended him credit without hesitation. His plantation books were clean. His reputation was secure. The burning of a single cabin did not threaten any of that. But one ledger entry survived the fire, and that entry still carried Langford's signature. Welcome to Dark Tales USA, the channel where plantation records, court files, and Freedmen's Bureau documents bring back the names history tried to erase. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, did you learn this story in school? Yes or no? And if you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe now so these records are never forgotten again. Because the entry that survived would eventually lead investigators back to a man who had watched ashes for 5 months and who had never stopped waiting. But to understand why Jacob Carter remained beside that burned ground for 150 days, we have to begin with the system that made it possible, and the man who controlled it. In 1858, Adams County, Mississippi was a place where paper carried power. Plantation ledgers recorded every transaction. Names were written beside prices. A person could disappear from one page and appear on another hundreds of miles away. Those entries were written with iron gall ink that left a sharp metallic smell on the page. Clerks dipped their pens into small glass bottles and copied whatever the owner instructed. Few questions were asked. Edward Langford controlled nearly 900 acres outside Natchez. Cotton fields covered most of the land. During harvest months, wagons creaked down dirt paths carrying heavy sacks toward the river docks. Langford's house stood on higher ground. White columns faced the road. Visitors approaching the property first saw that house, then the long rows of cabins behind it. The cabins were built from rough pine boards. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through small gaps in the roofs during winter evenings. That was where Jacob Carter lived with his wife Eliza and their son Thomas. In the plantation ledger, Jacob appeared simply as Jacob, field hand. No surname, no age recorded. But the ledger did record something else. In February of 1858, 2 additional names appeared beside his entry: Eliza and boy Thomas. 3 months later, those 2 names were gone. A trader's receipt had replaced them. The paper was thin and smelled faintly of tobacco from the clerk's desk drawer. It recorded a sale. Destination, Louisiana. At the time, no one in the county courthouse questioned that paperwork. But years later, one federal agent noticed that Jacob Carter's name remained on the page long after the others were removed. And the pages that followed contained something even stranger. Because later that same year, the cabin where Jacob's family had lived would burn, and Jacob would refuse to leave the ground where it stood. Jacob Carter worked the cotton fields at the southern edge of Langford's property. Witness testimony collected years later described him as a quiet man with broad shoulders. One laborer remembered the sound of his hoe striking the dry earth before sunrise. Work began before daylight. Damp morning air clung to clothing while the first rows were cleared. Jacob's cabin stood near a shallow creek. The water ran slowly during summer, carrying the smell of mud and wet leaves. That cabin was where his wife Eliza cooked meals over a small iron pot. Neighbors later recalled the smell of cornmeal baking on hot stones near the doorway. Their son Thomas was 6 years old in 1858. A bureau statement recorded that the boy often followed Jacob through the field rows, stepping carefully between the cotton plants. One witness remembered hearing the child laugh when crows scattered from the crops. Small details like that rarely appear in plantation records. But when the Freedmen's Bureau later interviewed former laborers, several mentioned the same family. Not because of the violence that followed, but because they remembered the silence after Eliza and Thomas were taken south. The sale occurred in early spring. A trader's wagon arrived carrying chains and wooden crates of supplies. Dust rose from the road as the wagon turned toward the quarters. By afternoon, 2 names had been removed from Langford's ledger: Eliza, Thomas. Neighbors later said Jacob stood beside the wagon as it left. The sound of iron wheels against dry dirt could still be heard long after it disappeared past the fields. That was the last time he saw them before the war. For several months after the sale, Jacob continued working the fields, but the cabin where his family had lived remained occupied by only one person. And by autumn of that same year, even that cabin would be gone. The fire occurred late in 1858. No official county record described the event. But later Freedmen's Bureau testimony included statements from 3 former laborers who remembered the night. According to their accounts, shouting was heard near the cabins after dark. The smell of smoke reached the fields first. Dry pine boards burn quickly. Witnesses described flames rising through the roof before anyone could reach the door. By morning, only blackened beams remained. The ground where the cabin stood was covered in gray ash that drifted across the dirt when the wind moved. Jacob Carter survived. How he escaped was never fully recorded, but several witnesses later said he was seen standing beside the burned structure at sunrise. His hands were blistered. The air around the ruins still carried the sharp smell of wet charcoal. Langford ordered the debris cleared, but Jacob refused to move. For the next several days he remained near the site, sleeping on the ground beside the ashes. Neighbors said he spent long hours watching the road leading south. Days became weeks. The plantation continued operating. Cotton wagons moved past the ruins each morning, but Jacob remained beside the burned ground. By the end of the first month, some laborers began counting the days. 30, 40, 50. The ashes gradually mixed with the dirt after several rainstorms. The smell of burned wood faded. Jacob Carter did not leave. Witnesses later estimated he remained there nearly 5 months, 150 days. When federal agents began interviewing former laborers after the Civil War, several of them mentioned the same thing: the man who watched the place where his family had last lived. One word: how does this make you feel? Leave it in the comments. Because the story might have ended there. But in 1865 the war ended, and federal records began collecting names the plantation ledgers had erased. After the war ended in 1865, agents from the Freedmen's Bureau began traveling across Mississippi. Their work included recording labor contracts, investigating abuses, and helping formerly enslaved families locate relatives. One of those agents visited Adams County in early 1866. The courthouse records were stacked inside wooden cabinets that smelled of dust and lamp oil. Clerks brought out plantation ledgers when requested. Many entries were incomplete. Some pages had been removed entirely. But the Langford ledger still existed. It contained the February 1858 entry listing the sale of Eliza and Thomas Carter. The document also included Jacob Carter's name remaining on the property. The agent began interviewing former laborers. Several remembered the burned cabin. 3 mentioned the same unusual detail. Jacob Carter had stayed beside the ruins for months, waiting. By that time, Jacob himself had already approached the bureau office. His name appeared in a register of signatures entry dated 1866. The ink was uneven where his hand pressed the pen against the paper. He requested assistance locating his wife and son. Destination listed in the earlier ledger, Louisiana. Bureau correspondence began moving between offices. Letters were carried by horseback and river steamboat. One inquiry reached officials near Baton Rouge. Plantation records there confirmed that an enslaved woman named Eliza Carter and a child named Thomas had arrived in 1858. Both were still alive after the war. By 1867, the case could no longer be ignored, and the man who had once controlled their fate was about to lose the system that protected him. In the spring of 1867, Edward Langford was still living on his plantation outside Natchez. Reconstruction had changed the legal system, but many former slaveholders remained in place. Langford continued managing what remained of his property. But cotton prices had collapsed after the war. Debt notices began arriving from merchants who had once extended him credit. The papers were folded tightly and sealed with wax. One of those debts involved unpaid trading accounts connected to slave purchases before the war. Among the documents reviewed by federal officials was the same ledger that recorded the sale of Eliza and Thomas Carter. Langford had not destroyed it. He likely believed it carried no danger. After all, such transactions had once been legal. Entries in the ledger now connected those entries with testimony from former laborers and bureau correspondents. Evidence showed the separation of a family whose members were now legally free citizens. Creditors moved first. In late 1867, Langford's estate was seized to repay outstanding debts. Auction notices were posted on courthouse walls. The paper curled slightly in the humid Mississippi air. Langford's property was divided and sold. The plantation that once held nearly 900 acres was broken into smaller parcels. Jacob Carter learned of the Bureau's findings that same year. The agency confirmed that his wife and son had survived the war in Louisiana. Transportation arrangements were made through the Bureau network. For the first time since 1858, Jacob Carter left the ground where his cabin had once stood. Because by the end of that year, he was traveling south, toward the family he had waited for beside those ashes. Edward Langford's fall was not dramatic. It was recorded in paperwork, debt notices, auction listings, court records. In 1867, his estate was seized. Land parcels were sold individually. The cotton fields he once controlled were divided among new owners. His name disappeared from the county tax ledger within 2 years. Jacob Carter's name appeared somewhere else. A Freedmen's Bureau record from late 1867 confirmed his reunion with Eliza and Thomas in Louisiana. The document noted their arrival in the parish near Baton Rouge. The handwriting was careful and deliberate. 3 names written on the same line again: Jacob, Eliza, Thomas. The record did not describe their meeting. It did not record what they said to each other. It simply confirmed that they were together, 9 years after the separation. Jacob Carter had once remained beside the ashes of his burned cabin for 150 days. Witnesses said he watched the road every evening, waiting. The plantation where that cabin stood no longer exists. The land was divided after the war. The fields changed owners many times. But the ledger entry survived, and so did the Bureau record that followed it. One recorded the day a family was separated. The other recorded the day they were finally written together again. This record still exists. Others do not. If this story stayed with you, leave one word in the comments. Just one word.